Years ago, I rang the man in Melbourne who is in charge of assessing the food coming from Europe, whether it's radioactive or not. And I said, how do you decide which batches to test? Because the fallout came down in hot spots depending upon the rainfall, so it's very heterogeneous, it's not uniform in Europe. There are over 600 farms in Cumbria and Wales growing lambs, and the lambs are so full of cesium-137, they're so radioactive they can't be sold. And the government's closed the farms down for 100 years, but it should be 600 years, because that's how long the cesium lasts in the soil and concentrates in the grass and gets into the meat. So he said, well, we do random spot checks. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, the computer picks out certain batches to test, which of course means you're going to miss a lot of stuff. And I said, what do you do when you find radioactive food? He said, oh, we dilute it with non-radioactive food. The solution to pollution by dilution is fallacious when it comes to radiation, because when you eat radioactive food, it bioconcentrates back in your body. I specifically look at where food comes from in the shops, and I don't buy anything that comes from Europe. And we have gorgeous food here, including homemade olive oil and the like. That's a worry, but we should be selling our beautiful, clean, non-radioactive food to a radioactive Europe. But we don't do that because we want to sell uranium to make more countries radioactive if there's a meltdown. Now, how did this occur that more than 250,000 people have already died from Chernobyl, yet the International Atomic Energy Agency, an arm of the United Nations, says only 56 people died? Well, it's because in 1958 or 9, the World Health Organization signed a contract with the IAEA to say that they would not study any accidents related to nuclear power if the IAEA said that they were not to. So the WHO has done no studies on what's happening in Chernobyl. Over 10,000 people have had their thyroids removed for thyroid cancer. That's an unheard of medical situation. I practiced medicine for many, many decades, and I only ever saw one case of thyroid cancer. I've seen none in children, and a lot of the children are getting thyroid cancer, and huge numbers are getting leukemia. There are homes full of the most grossly deformed children that my colleagues, paediatricians, have never seen before. This is a conspiracy beyond belief. It's wicked. And if the people of the world knew about this, then it would mean the end of nuclear power, which it should have meant anyway from the start.
Why don't the people of the world know?
Well, because the IAEA struts around and says, you know, there have been virtually no deaths at Chernobyl, and people believe them, and the press is lazy. Many people working in the media now are young, they don't even remember Chernobyl. And the bosses of the media, they don't necessarily want to print the truth. This is a huge story. Massive. It's like the way America covered up the data from Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first 5 years. They didn't tell people, the world, that people were dying of acute radiation illness with their hair falling out, vomiting and bleeding to death. They didn't tell people that the children were getting leukemia. It was a total cover-up for at least 5 years. So the nuclear industry is rife with lies. And more than that, it's endangering life on the planet, because as we export uranium and it gets into nuclear power plants, which make plutonium, which is the fuel for nuclear weapons, which lasts for 500,000 years, we are causing the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. Well, you may sell it to a country that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and promises it won't build bombs from its plutonium, but that might be one leader and one government, but you know how governments change within our lifetime. Dictators arise, dictators fall, all sorts of crazy things happen. And we're talking about plutonium that lives for 500,000 years. I don't understand how these people like Gareth Evans, Martin Ferguson, Kevin Rudd, John Howard can't get their flaming heads around the very obvious. Why do they have such tunnel vision and little brains? And we're talking about nuclear war. And when we talk about nuclear war, we have to know that 97% of the world's nuclear weapons belong to America and Russia, and thousands of them are ready to go on hair trigger alert with a 3-minute decision time by Putin or Obama. And there are enough weapons now to overkill every person 7 times in the world. That means they die, they stand up, they die again. It's a Pentagon term, of course. And as more countries get nuclear weapons, as they are so doing now, I mean, there are, I think, 70 nations that now want nuclear reactors, and that means they'll have access to weapons. You can find the design on the internet. I mean, it's easy to make a bomb. All you need is plutonium fuel or uranium fuel. As more countries get them, I mean, for instance, if Iran does get a nuclear weapon and it uses it on Israel, which has the 3rd largest arsenal in the world, 200 to 400 bombs, there would be a massive annihilation of the Middle East. But that could trigger, with the anxiety and America's attachment to Israel and Russia's unease about the whole Middle East situation, it could trigger a holocaust between Russia and America. So international anxiety induced by 9/11 or whatever, when they went to the highest state of nuclear alert at 9/11, because no one knew what was happening, from DEFCON 6 to DEFCON 2, just before they pressed the button. No one knows about that. That was on the website for a few days till they took it down. The Strategic Air Command website, Stratcom. You know, those situations, we have false alerts and false starts to start nuclear war many days in Russia and America. I mean, we're just sitting on the edge of the nuclear holocaust cliff. And as we export uranium, we are potentiating that risk, that danger, that anxiety. As Kennedy said, the nuclear sword of Damocles twists over our heads.
Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
Recent agreements signed between Medvedev and Obama call actually for the abolition of only about 50 weapons on each side. And these are the strategic ones, and the missiles both in the submarines and on land-based missiles. And there are about 2,500 of these, 2,100 in Russia and 2,100 in America ready to go. So in fact it's really a face-saving thing. I think it may be for Obama to placate those dreadful Republicans who negate everything he wants to do, and to get Russia on side and build up their trust. But on the other hand, America's intent on building a missile defense system, which really freaks Russia out, because if they have missiles that can be launched to hit the Russian missiles and destroy them once they're launched, then that negates their nuclear overkill. It's all crazy thinking. But they say, well, to overcome that, they have to build more missiles, so it starts a new nuclear arms race. So that's the first treaty. It's the New START Treaty, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. And then the Non-Proliferation Treaty is up for review now, and it comes up for review every 5 years. And there's a huge conference at the UN, and Obama will speak, which is really quite significant. And Obama has already called in Prague last year for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So he's got it in his bone marrow. I'm sure he heard me talk in Central Park in 1982 when we had 1 million people in Central Park, and he was a young student at Columbia University and wrote 2 really excellent articles about how to produce abolition of nuclear weapons between Russia and America. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty was written about, I can't remember the date, but decades ago. And it says, fundamentally, that that countries will support other countries having nuclear power, but no one is to build bombs. The only people to have bombs are the ones who already had them, and at that time it was France, China, America, Russia, and England. Well, since that time there have been more: Israel, Pakistan, India, and maybe Iran, we're not sure. But it was to say those 5 countries can have nuclear weapons, and you guys out there, you can't have any, see. On the other hand, they said, we want you to have nuclear power. You're allowed to have all the technology, all the facilities to have nuclear power. So it's a push me, pull you animal. It's saying you're not allowed to build bombs, but you want the equipment so that you can build bombs. It's absolutely insane, because the equipment, A, can produce highly enriched uranium to make bombs, which is what Iran is up to, and B, make plutonium in the reactors themselves. And both highly enriched uranium and plutonium are fuel for nuclear weapons. So the discussion going on at the United Nations and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, no nuclear countries have abided by it, because Article 6 of the treaty says that the nuclear nations, if other countries didn't build nuclear bombs, they would disarm. I think it was written in about 58. Well, they've done exactly the opposite. They've built more and more and more and more and more nuclear weapons with a kind of nuclear addiction. It is a nuclear addiction. It's like alcoholism, but so much more dangerous for those powers. So if we have a nuclear war, they won't exist. Neither will any of this. It will be gone. We will have destroyed life on the planet.
Well, what about the idea of possible limited nuclear wars and things like depleted uranium and mini nukes? Is it possible to have these sorts of conflicts without endangering the whole planet?
You can't have a limited nuclear war, I think, without involving Russia and America, because it would produce such international anxiety and tension. And the weapons are sort of programmed, ready to take off with sort of any minor infraction in the world, a la 9/11. A limited nuclear war between Pakistan and India, and both have about 65 to 80 bombs each, would produce such devastation that it would cause nuclear winter. And so crops would not grow for probably a decade. Billions of people would starve to death, and it would be cold and there's nothing to eat. Billions. But that could also precipitate a global war between Russia and America, and then no one lives and nothing lives. If someone had a small, say a terrorist blew up New York City, yeah, that's sad. And it could happen. But do you know that Russia has 40 hydrogen bombs targeted on New York City as we speak? 40. There are 60 targeted on Moscow. Probably at least 60 on Washington, D.C. What are we talking about? I wrote an article with Robert McNamara, who's Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, about this. It was published in the LA Times. But people, A, don't know these facts, and B, if they do, they sort of slough them off and practice psychic numbing. They're more worried about terrorists, and that's a method of displacement activity. If you put rats in a cage and threaten them with a lethal situation, they run away and do something irrelevant to that which threatens them. So to worry about terrorist attacks or small mini nukes, yeah, it's bad, but not worrying about the whole of this beautiful planet being destroyed tonight by accident or by design or whatever, computer error or hackers, the Chinese are hacking into the Pentagon computers now, is a form of insanity. And it's also a form of passive suicide. We are a very strange species.